Hello artists, and welcome back to another art tutorial with Mr. White. Today, we're doing a technique introduction with the Ebony pencil. To do that, we're going to make a 6-value scale, a 1-square value gradient, as well as a 1-square hatching gradient, and 2 cubes with different textures. We're going to practice control over the value and how we use our shading pencils. To do this, we're going to need one of these Ebony pencils, a blending stump, and some sandpaper. I'm going to show you what we used sandpaper for right now, which is to clean the blending stump when it's dirty. To do that, you're going to twist at the wrist or fingers and pull with your arm, trying to keep the angle and point of the blending stump sharp as you remove the dirty part of the blending stump. Also, for supplies, an eraser wouldn't hurt. Our first step in this process is going to be dividing our page in half. We're only going to need half a page in our journals for this exercise. So first, draw a line across the middle to use the top half of our page. Then I'm going to go about 1.5 inches to an inch away from the edge of the page and draw a vertical line to make a rectangle on the top left of the page. I will divide that into 6 different values with 5 different horizontal lines. Then I'm going to draw 2 squares beside it, and I'm going to label those as gradient and hatching. Now we're also going to make 2 texture cubes, which is going to help us to develop a couple of textures and get better control over value. Now if you don't know how to draw a cube, start with a square, and then you're going to make 3 lines that should all, as close as possible, be the exact same length and angle. They're going to be diagonal angles coming from 3 adjacent corners. Then just connect the empty space between those 2 lines like you see here. We're going to label these 2 cubes as grass, fur, and scumbling. These are a couple of basic textures that have a lot of different uses. Our first step in actually completing this exercise, now that our setup is done, is going to be to shade in our value scale. And the first value is going to be the lightest gray we can. We're not going to put any pressure on our pencil at all. We're just letting gravity do the work. And I find it easier to let gravity do the work if I hold the pencil from the very back. And also notice that I'm shading in one direction. Now I'm going to use a blending stump after. You'll notice how I hold that, not putting pressure in the middle of the stump. And I'm going to use the blending stump, and I'm going to blend across the mark that I just made. So I was going side to side, I'm going to blend with an up and down motion. As we'll see later, having your different layers of marks have the same direction can build useful texture, but for a smooth finish, we don't really want it. Now, for our second values, we're going to do the exact same thing as step 1, using a single direction and no pressure at all to shade a layer. Then we're going to rotate. I turn my page, but you can turn your hand and arm if you prefer. And we're going to add another layer right on top of that first one, also with no pressure at all. Then we're going to blend the 2 together, which hopefully will already have a fairly neutralized texture. I recommend blending them either with circular, sort of round, overlapping O shape, or diagonal. Now, we're about to start our third value. This will have 2 passes, and you'll see that they both go in different crosswise or perpendicular directions. The first step, or the first layer, is the first time on this value scale that I'm actually pressing at all with my hand, just a little bit. I'm going to try to make that first layer about match what my value 2 looked like. And then I'll put a second layer right on top with the same pressure. So 2 layers, both of which I'm just barely pressing. Then I'm going to blend, and again, just like before, blending in a different direction. Something you may notice, and it's especially apparent in the video, is blending makes the square look a little bit darker. So you may want to err on the side of keeping things a little lighter than you think they need to be at first. You can always go back in and darken things up. You can lighten things up too, but it's a little bit more challenging. Now, in this video, I'm moving on to box 4 and 5, and in box 4, we repeat the exact same process as we did in 3, using one layer at one direction, trying to make a complete covering of the box, about matching the box above, and then rotating to a perpendicular direction, and making a second layer, trying to keep the exact same pressure, and finishing that out by blending in a separate or different direction. And here I am, doing the same thing in box 5, making 2 layers, this time pressing fairly firmly, making my first layer slightly lighter than the base layer, but notice that I'm still on that first layer, switching and putting a second layer on, which is getting quite dark now. But notice there's still a little bit of white space between my pencil marks, which means there's still a little bit of space for the blending to work. In the final box, we're going to press as firmly as possible, trying to get an even coat on the entire box. And if you see some spots that didn't quite stay consistent, like my box 4 and 5 are a little bit messy, that's okay. You can go back and lighten that up, as I'm about to do. I find it's often easier to spot those problems or those areas that could be improved once the final darkest darks are put in. And you're going to want to make sure to go back in and use the blending step again. Now for our next box, we're going to make a gradient, or a single box that fades from the darkest possible to the lightest possible. And this is all about being able to control our transitions over value. So take your time with this. You'll notice that I start by finding my very darkest dark on one corner, and then going to the opposite corner and shading with the very lightest pressure I can, pushing more firmly as I head up toward that first darkest corner. You'll also notice that I take at least 2 passes on this. It's not something that I do all in one go. It takes a little bit of adjusting and working back and forth. So if it takes you a little bit of time, that's okay. Another thing to keep in mind when we're making our gradient is that we want to blend, but it's going to be easiest if we blend from light to dark. Once we start blending in the dark, it's going to get our blending stump all covered in darkness, and if we go from dark to light, we'll end up getting a big muddy effect, and it won't be a very smooth transition. The goal of the gradient is a smooth transition, so that helps. For our next box, we're going to make hatching. This is another kind of gradient, and it might work a little bit better with some other media, a firmer pencil or marker or something like that, but it also works in the Ebony pencil, and it's basically filling an area with lines. In hatching, all of the lines go in one direction, and the thickness and the density, or how many lines there are in a given area, is what makes the value darker. Hatching works really well in non-blendable media, but it also has a nice effect in blendable media like this. Now, there's also cross-hatching, as you can see me adding through here, and that's simply adding a second layer of marks that go in a perpendicular direction. However, with hatching, we do not blend. Now, for our next boxes, we're going to make textures. And texture is mostly made of light and shadow of objects. So we're going to need a light in our image. So I just drew a little light. You don't really have to draw the light or label it, but I want you to see how the logic here is. So Because the light is on the top left, the top of the boxes is going to be the lightest part, the face or side facing us will be the medium value, and the darkest value will be on the right-hand side. You don't need to label that, but you can. Now, for the first texture of grass or fur, it's always going to be growing upward or in a direction. Usually, the marks will be about the same length and about the same thickness. So we're going to pick one direction and shape of mark to make and make a bunch of them. On the top, we want to use very little pressure and leave some white space between the marks, making that texture in layers. As we move to the face of the box, we're going to use 2 layers. The first one is going to be very similar to what we did on the top, except all growing upward rather than sort of angling as we had up there. Notice that these lines start low and go up, and then I pick my pencil up, and we're not zigzagging, but each individual stroke or each individual mark has a start and an end and is followed by another. Once you have the first layer of shading down here, plenty of space between the marks, you're going to use a little more pressure and a point of pencil and put a second layer on this face. Notice that you're not pressing super hard with either layer and that the grass is made of individual marks with space between them. So we can see some of the white page, some of the first layer, and some of the second darker layer. On the right-hand side, we're going to repeat the same steps, but using a heavier pressure and thicker marks, so that there's less white space showing and more of the medium and darker grays. In the base value, or the base layer, we're still going to use not a lot of pressure, but we're going to make fairly dense lines and more pressure than on the base of the face. And then again, using a fair amount of pressure, we're going to put a second layer on, as you see right now. And I'll call that done. For our next texture, we're going to use scumbling, which I use in foliage or rocks, but it can be a lot of different things. It's basically an organic semi-scribbling mark that is not perfect or the same thing repeated. Notice that there's space in between. Just like on the first texture, the top is very light. For this one, I use the face of the pencil rather than the point, as I don't want very rich lines. I want the suggestion in the face allows a more organic feel. Moving to the face or the front of the box, you'll see that I'm pressing a little bit more firmly, using kind of a medium pressure here for my layer. You'll also notice that I'm not making just a bunch of connected circles or overlapping ovals. I'm not exactly making a scribble. Scumbling is more organic and sort of chaotic. You'll also notice that I use 1 layer of marking here instead of 2, but I need it a little bit more dark of marks. And then I go into my blending style and I use the same pattern of marks. So there's some white showing, some medium gray, and some spots that are fairly dark. Moving to the right-hand side, I'm going to keep on making a darker version of this texture, trying to get my first pass to approximately match the face, and then I'm going to use a second layer for the very dark side. That's a little bit different than the procedure from the grass and fur. It's because it's a different texture and it needs a different procedure. So I'm putting on a second layer using the point of my pencil, pressing fairly firmly, and there I have a cube with scumbled texture in 3 different values. I can add in a shadow if I want to, which of course would just run away from the light, and I chose to do so because I think it looks cool. Happy making!